Hello class, Mr. Long here. It's been quite some time since we've had our last video lecture. So today we are going to do a few things. We are going to do a quick review, so stuff that you've already read about, have answered questions about, have talked about so far with the term imperialism and what imperialism is. And remember, the easiest way to understand what imperialism is when a big, strong, powerful country takes over a smaller, weaker country, and they take it over for various reasons. So that is really what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to go into more detail. We're actually going to be doing um, a DBQ and covering documents of a DBQ, but we're not going to be writing out a full essay like we did before. Um, so, with that being said, the main question that I want everyone to continue to think about throughout this video lecture and throughout the next couple of days is what was the main reason? And the main reason for the Europeans going into Africa and dividing up Africa and taking over parts of Africa. Now, you guys have already read an article on really the five major reasons why Europeans went into Africa and colonized and took over. We're going to cover those again, and we're going to add a little more to it. So, with that being said, we're going to go ahead and move on. So, the three major motives behind imperialism, and we've already discussed five. You guys read an article on five. You guys did a slides presentation on the five major motives. But really, we need to talk about the economic drive or the economic motive that the Europeans have behind going into Africa, colonizing parts of Africa. And bottom line is money, trade, goods, raw materials that Europeans need, especially coming after the Industrial Revolution. And we know what the Industrial Revolution is all about. It's all about manufactured goods. It's taking raw materials and it is manufacturing them into a good that you can sell and make money from. So anything that has to do with money, becoming more powerful because of money, major corporations or businesses making money, that's going to have to do with the economic aspect or motive behind the Europeans going into Africa and colonizing. The next major motive is political. Now, I'm going to mention a couple terms such as nationalism. And nationalism is really, really important, especially when we start getting to World War One. All nationalism is when you take pride in your country. You want your country to be the absolute best, the strongest, and the only way for your country to be the most powerful, the best, is for your country to go out and get more land because more land equals more power. So, what ends up happening is that European countries are going to go out and compete with each other for more land. It's like a big competition. The more land a country can get or colonize, the more powerful they will become. And really, what happens is that creates a competition between the European countries. And eventually, that is going to lead to some sort of conflict. And within years, it's going to lead to World War One. Finally, cultural. Cultural is a major, major motive behind the Europeans going into Africa and colonizing and taking parts of Africa. It's a way of thinking. Hopefully, you guys read this in the article, but the Europeans are going to think a certain way. They are going to think that they are superior, they are the superior race, and the Africans are inferior to them or they are below them. They also look at the Africans as being savages, as not being tamed, I guess you can say, and the only way to help these savages is to go into Africa and to colonize, to help them, to civilize them. And of course, the Africans were doing just fine before the Europeans came in. But once again, it's the way the Europeans thought. We're going to talk about social Darwinism, survival of the fittest. We're going to talk about racism because, bottom line, Europeans were racist. They believed that they were better than the Africans. And that was definitely not the case, but that's just the way that they thought. So, once again, we are going to cover these three major motives. We can also say that these are three major categories of imperialism: economic, political, and cultural. So, everything that we talk about in this video lecture will fall into one of these categories or even overlap and go into more. So, it's either going to be an economic motive, it's going to be a political motive, it's going to be a cultural motive, or it's going to be a mixture of the two. So we've mentioned these before, and hopefully remember this from the article, but these are the 5 major reasons why Europeans colonized Africa. I've already mentioned the economic reason, but the Europeans are looking for new resources, they're looking for raw materials, they're looking for stuff needed to manufacture goods to make them rich. You're also going to have private companies, very powerful companies, that are going to colonize parts of Africa to make a profit. Bottom line is, when I say economic, you guys need to think of money and profit. And the Europeans trying to make as much money and become as wealthy as they possibly can. The next reason or motive that the Europeans have to go into Africa and colonize is exploratory. And there's multiple reasons why Europeans want to explore. And honestly, all exploring means is to look around. The Europeans are unfamiliar with the African continent. Really, they've only have explored the coastal regions and parts of Africa because they could not get into the interior of Africa. When I say interior, that means to the inside of Africa. Really, for a few reasons, but the major reason was disease. Um, Africa has certain diseases that the Europeans have never been exposed to, such as malaria. And once Europeans caught a disease like malaria, they didn't know how to treat it and they would quickly die. But of course, the Europeans, being very advanced technologically and advanced when it comes to medicine, they were able to develop medications and drugs like quinine. And quinine was something that was taken that would fight off the disease, such as malaria, and that would allow the Europeans to move more into the interior of Africa. So there's multiple reasons why the Europeans wanted to explore. I've already mentioned medical reasons, scientific reasons, just adventure. They wanted to be adventurous. They wanted to go see new places. Um, I've already mentioned the term nationalism. Nationalism is when you take pride in your country. You want your country to be the best, and you want your country to be powerful. And more land equals more power. So getting more land, new trade routes, new people to trade with. This would all fall under the exploratory. And once again, these motives overlap. So if I mention new trade routes under exploratory, that also has to do with economics. So that's really important that we understand that a lot of these motives will overlap with each other. The third reason or motive is ethnocentric, and this has to do with the cultural part. This has to do with racism, the way the Europeans viewed the Africans. And I've already mentioned this before, but we're going to talk about white man's burden, the burden of the Europeans feeling that it is their responsibility to take care of the Africans. It is their job to civilize the Africans. They're going to look at the Africans as being like babies, and the Europeans are going to be like the parents, and it's their job to take care of their kids or their babies because the Africans are not able to take care of themselves. But once again, this doesn't necessarily mean that is true. It's just a way of thinking. So it's really important that we understand that the Europeans think a certain way, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. The next reason is political. I've already mentioned political. It has to do with nationalism, has to do with more land, more power, and of course, this is going to create major competition between European countries that will eventually lead to conflict and eventually lead to war. And of course, our last reason has to do with religious reasons. A lot of European nations will send out missionaries, and missionaries are people that basically just spread religion, specifically Christianity. So you're going to have a lot of missionaries going out into different parts of Africa, and they are going to be converting Africans to Christians. Now, this is going to become a major, major problem because the Africans have their own religions. And some of these Africans, or a lot of these African tribes, are polytheistic, which means they believe in many, many gods. And the Europeans are going to force them to convert to Christianity. And Christianity is a monotheistic religion, which means they only believe in one God. So there's going to be a lot of problems when the Europeans are forcing the Africans into a certain religion. But once again, the Europeans have a way of thinking. They feel that their race is the best and that they are superior, and it is their job to convert, to help, and to take care of the Africans because the Africans cannot do it themselves. So, with that being said, we're going to go ahead and move to document A. And document A is a map of Africa. And this map of Africa should look very, very similar to assignment 1 that we did earlier this week. That was almost like our warm up, kind of get us starting to think about what imperialism is. Now, the map of Africa that we looked at a few days ago was multicolored. And that map all the different colors on that map represented different European nations that went in and colonized and took over parts of Africa. And this map is identical. So really what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and go into a little more detail about this map, talk about this map, and then from there, you guys are going to fill out the bottom portion of document A. So first things first, I need everyone to please write political motive at the very top of document A and then take a highlighter and highlight because this has everything to do with the political motive of the Europeans. Once again, they are competing for land. The more land that a country has, the more power that they have. So you're going to see several different European countries basically carving up Africa and getting as much land as they possibly can because it's like one big competition with each other. So underneath political motive, you guys notice in the little asterisk mark, I wrote down more land equals more power. The more land the Europeans can get, the stronger they are. What I need you guys to do now is please highlight partition. Now, the term or word partition means the division. So this is the division of Africa in the year 1884 to 1885. Now, those years are very, very important. And in those years, you guys should already know from the reading from the textbook and the questions that you answered from the textbook that these are the years where the Berlin Conference took place. So I need you to please circle those years, 1884 to 1885, and then I need you to make a side note. And then right next to those dates, I need you to write down Berlin Conference, underline it, highlight it. And this is where 14 European nations met. And they met for it was about a year. And these European nations met and discussed how to divide up Africa. And the ironic part about this Berlin Conference was that no African leaders or countries were invited to this conference or this meeting. So it had to do with their continent, but they had absolutely no say whatsoever in the division of Africa or what was happening to their countries. So if you think about that, very, very unfair. But once again, it all goes back to the way the Europeans thought, the way they felt about the Africans, and the idea of them being a superior race and them being better than, and the Africans being inferior. And it was their job. And it was basically okay for them to do what they were doing. So that's really, really important that we understand what the Berlin Conference was. What I need you guys to please do now is I need you to find and locate the two countries of Ethiopia and Liberia, and they're both highlighted on my map. I need you guys to do the same. And really, what I need you guys to do is, I think I mentioned this in class, was you need to make a side note. I don't care what side, just make sure you guys draw an arrow. But Ethiopia and Liberia were the only two African countries that remained independent of European rule. And this was for one reason. They were unified, which means they came together as a country and they were able to fight off the Europeans. I mentioned this in class before, but all the other African countries were not unified. Each African country was made up of several different tribes, and these tribes had different ideas, they had different opinions, and they often fought against each other. So think about it. Within a country, you're going to have several different tribes, and it was like one big giant civil war. They were always fighting against each other. And they were either fighting for land, they were fighting for water, like rivers, trade routes, but they were always fighting against each other, which means they were not unified, they were not together. So when the Europeans came in, they were already weak. They were fighting against each other, so it made it really easy for the Europeans to come in and just take over right away because they were not unified and they were very, very weak. So it's important to note that Liberia and Ethiopia were the only two African countries that were able to remain independent of European rule. Um, It's also important, if you guys notice, and I need you to please highlight in the key on the bottom left of the map, Great Britain and France. So circle both of those countries, and they are in the darker shade. I shouldn't say darker shade because the Spanish or Spain is the darkest one, but um, they controlled the most land in Africa. So France and Great Britain were really the two countries that are going to colonize the most land in Africa. So what I need everyone to do now is, if you missed any part of this lecture, you don't understand, please rewind it. Please play it again if you need to. Make sure you pause it and make sure that you have all of the annotations and all of the correct highlights. That will go ahead and conclude the first part of document A, and we will eventually move on to the rest of the documents.